I knew something was wrong the second I saw the fresh dirt in my backyard, but I never imagined my quiet little piece of land would turn into the center of a county investigation. I came home expecting to mow the grass, check the mail, maybe grill something that evening. Instead, I found a trench cut straight through the most important part of my property, and a bright black irrigation pipe running across my land like someone had drawn a line and decided my boundaries didn't matter. The strange thing was, the people who did it weren't strangers. They were my new neighbors, the kind of people who smile politely at you while quietly convincing themselves that rules are just suggestions for everyone else. My name is Daniel Carter, and for almost 20 years I lived on a quiet 2-acre property outside Gainesville, Florida, far enough from the city to hear birds in the morning and close enough that I could still get groceries without planning an expedition. It wasn't a luxury estate or some magazine cover property, but it was mine, and I loved every corner of it. The house was built back in 2008, surrounded by tall oak trees, sandy soil, and a slope that carried rainwater naturally away from the foundation. When I bought the place, one of the first things I did was upgrade the septic system because I wanted everything done properly from the beginning. I spent nearly $4,000 installing a new drain field behind the house, had everything inspected, and made sure the location was properly marked. I even kept the paperwork in a folder in my office because, honestly, I was the kind of person who saved receipts for things I bought 5 years ago just in case I needed them someday. My wife used to joke that I could probably tell her the exact date I replaced a water filter or changed a battery in a smoke detector. She wasn't wrong. I liked knowing things were done right. The septic field wasn't something I thought about every day, and that was the whole point. Good systems are invisible. They quietly do their job while you live your life. I planted native grass over the area, cleared some brush around it myself, and kept that part of the yard open because I knew disturbing the ground could create problems. It wasn't the prettiest part of the property, but it was reliable, and after years of maintaining that land, I knew exactly what belonged there and what didn't. Then, the Holloways moved in. Their names were Mark and Rebecca Holloway, and they bought the 5-acre property uphill from mine. At first, I actually thought they seemed nice. They were both real estate professionals, and from the first conversation, it was obvious they had big plans. They talked about turning their property into some kind of modern country retreat, a place with gardens, outdoor entertaining areas, decorative ponds, and every feature you see in those expensive home renovation videos online. Mark had the energy of a guy who always had a project going. Rebecca was more polished, always dressed perfectly, always speaking with confidence, like she had already imagined the finished version of everything before anyone else could catch up. When they first introduced themselves, I brought over a small basket of local coffee and some homemade cookies my wife had made. That's just how we did things where I lived. Neighbors looked out for each other. You didn't need to become best friends, but you respected the fact that people around you were also trying to build a peaceful life. The first warning sign came during a conversation a few weeks after they moved in. Rebecca was standing near my backyard fence, looking down toward the open grassy area behind my house. She looked around and said, "You know, you have a lot of unused space back here. Have you ever thought about doing something with it?" I smiled and told her, "Actually, that area has my septic drain field underneath it, so I keep it clear." I expected a normal response. Something like, "Oh, I didn't realize that." Instead, she just nodded slowly and gave me a small smile. It was the kind of smile people give when they hear information, but don't really accept it. "Interesting," she said. "It just looks like empty grass from up here." I laughed a little because I thought maybe she was joking. I told her again that the system was underground, inspected, and that digging there wasn't an option. She said, of course, we wouldn't want to mess with anything important." At the time, I believed her. Looking back now, I realized that was probably the moment when she decided my property was just another part of the landscape she wanted to redesign. A few weeks later, my wife and I left town for a long weekend to visit family. It wasn't a long trip, just enough time to relax, get away from the routine, and come back refreshed. I remember thinking how nice it was that life had become so predictable. No major problems, no drama, no unexpected surprises. Sometimes you don't realize how peaceful your life is until someone else decides to disrupt it. When we returned Sunday afternoon, I noticed something strange before I even parked the truck. There were muddy tire marks along the side of my property. At first, I thought maybe a delivery driver had turned around or someone had accidentally crossed the edge of my yard. But then I saw the dirt. fresh dirt, a long disturbed section of ground running across the grass. I got out of the truck and walked closer, and that's when my stomach dropped. Someone had dug a trench directly through my septic field. Not near it, not around it, right through the middle. The trench was about 2 feet wide, with exposed soil and broken grass on both sides. And sitting inside that trench was a new black irrigation pipe that came from the Holloway's property, crossed down the slope, and disappeared underground on my side. For a few seconds, I just stood there trying to process what I was looking at. You know that feeling when your brain keeps trying to explain something before accepting what your eyes are showing you? That was me. I was thinking, maybe there's some misunderstanding. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe someone made a mistake. Because the alternative was harder to accept. Someone had looked at my land, ignored the boundaries, ignored the conversation we had, and decided they could use it anyway. I walked over to their house and knocked on the door. Mark opened it wearing work gloves and a shirt covered in dirt. The timing alone told me everything I needed to know. "Hey, Daniel," he said casually. "What's up?" I looked at him and said, "I need to ask you about the trench behind my house." He glanced toward the yard and immediately knew what I meant. "Oh, that? Yeah, the irrigation crew handled that. We needed better water flow for the gardens." I told him, "You cut through my septic drain field." He paused for half a second, then shrugged. "Are you sure?" The landscaper checked everything. It was just grass. That sentence bothered me more than anything else. Not because he was wrong. People make mistakes. But because he sounded like the mistake wasn't important. Like the fact that it was my property and my system somehow made no difference. I explained that the septic field was not empty land. It was a regulated system, installed and inspected, and damaging it could create serious problems. Mark leaned against the doorway and said, "Daniel, we weren't trying to cause trouble. We just needed a better irrigation setup. You probably won't even notice." I remember standing there thinking about how often people use that phrase when they want permission after the fact. You won't even notice. They say it when they borrow something without asking. They say it when they cross a line. They say it when they already decided your opinion doesn't matter. I could have argued. I could have yelled. Honestly, part of me wanted to. But something told me that getting angry would only give them a chance to make this about my reaction instead of their actions. So, I simply said, "I'm going to document everything." Mark smiled slightly, almost like he thought I was making a bigger deal out of nothing. "Sure, Daniel, do what you need to do." I went home, grabbed my phone, and started taking pictures from every angle. I recorded the trench, the pipe, the disturbed soil, and the exact location compared to the survey markers. Then I opened the folder in my office that my wife always teased me about, pulled out the septic records, and started making calls. At that moment, I still didn't know how far this would go. I didn't know that a simple irrigation project would turn into a county case. I didn't know that the people who dismissed my concerns would eventually have to undo every inch of work they had done. All I knew was one thing. My property wasn't just grass, and my silence wasn't permission. I had spent years taking care of that land, and I wasn't going to let someone treat it like an empty space on a satellite image. The next morning, I called the County Environmental Services office, and I'll admit, I wasn't expecting much. I've dealt with government offices before, and sometimes you call thinking you're going to explain your situation only to spend 3 hours being transferred between departments while everyone tells you it's someone else's problem. But this time was different. The person who answered actually listened. I explained what happened, gave them my address, told them about the septic system, and emailed over the photos I had taken. The woman on the phone became noticeably more serious when I mentioned that the irrigation pipe had been installed directly through the drain field. She asked me a few specific questions, then said, "Mr. Carter, we're going to send someone out to inspect this." That sentence alone made me feel like maybe I wasn't just shouting into the wind. 2 days later, a county inspector named Harold Bennett showed up at my property. He wasn't dramatic about it. He didn't arrive like someone looking for a fight. He came with a clipboard, a measuring tool, and the calm expression of someone who had seen every kind of homeowner dispute imaginable. I walked him back there, and the second he saw the trench, his expression changed. He crouched down, looked at the exposed soil, followed the direction of the pipe, and then asked me, "Do you have the original septic layout?" I handed in the paperwork I had kept for years. He looked at it, looked back at the ground, and shook his head. "This is exactly where the distribution lines run." Hearing that from him was strange because, deep down, I already knew it. But there is something different about hearing an official say it out loud. It turns a frustrating situation into a confirmed reality. Harold spent nearly an hour inspecting the area. He used a probe rod to check the ground, measured the trench, took his own photos, and documented every detail. Then he stood up, looked toward the Holloway's property uphill, and said something I'll never forget. They didn't just dig near your system. They cut through it. He explained that septic systems are designed carefully, and the drain field isn't just random dirt where water happens to disappear. The soil, the pipes, the spacing, the location, all of it matters. Changing one part can affect the entire system. Then came the part that really surprised me. He told me this wasn't just a property disagreement. It was a code violation and a potential environmental issue. They'll be receiving a notice, he said. I thanked him, and after he left, I stood there looking at the trench again. The funny thing was, I wasn't even angry anymore. I was disappointed. There is a difference. Anger burns hot and fast. Disappointment just sits there. It makes you realize that the person standing across from you doesn't see the situation the same way you do. To me, my backyard represented years of work, responsibility, and respect for where I lived. To them, it was an open area that could solve a landscaping problem. A few days passed, and I thought maybe the Holloways would finally come over and have a normal conversation. Maybe they would admit they made a mistake. Maybe they would say, Daniel, we messed up. Let's figure out how to fix this. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't trying to ruin their lives. I just wanted them to understand that they had crossed a serious line. But instead of coming to my door themselves, I received a letter from their attorney. The letter was polite, professional, and carefully worded. It said they were willing to resolve the matter amicably. At first, I thought maybe that was a good sign. Then I read the actual offer. They would replace the damaged grass, restore the area with new sod, and provide me with a gift certificate for landscaping services. I actually laughed when I finished reading it, not because it was funny, but because it was almost unbelievable. They had damaged a regulated septic system, and their solution was basically, we'll make the yard look nice again. It reminded me of someone scratching your car and offering to wash it. The problem wasn't the appearance. The problem was what was underneath. My wife looked at the letter and said, they still don't understand, do they? And she was right. They were treating this like a disagreement between neighbors. But this wasn't about a patch of grass. It was about whether someone could make decisions on my property because it was convenient for them. I responded through email, but I kept it simple. No insults, no emotional language, just facts. I attached the photographs, the septic records, and the county inspector's report. I told them that I was willing to cooperate with any proper restoration process, but I would not accept a cosmetic fix for a structural problem. After that, things moved quickly. The county scheduled a hearing, and honestly, I expected it to be more complicated than it was. I had spent nights imagining all kinds of arguments they might make. Maybe they would claim they didn't know. Maybe they would blame the landscaper. Maybe they would say the pipe wasn't actually damaging anything. But when the day came, the evidence spoke for itself. The county inspector presented his photographs. The original septic documents showed the exact location of the drain field. Their irrigation pipe crossed directly through the system. There was no confusion. There was no gray area. Just a decision someone made without permission. Mark tried to explain that they had relied on the landscaper and thought the area was safe. And I understand mistakes happen. Really, I do. But the problem was that after they discovered the mistake, they didn't stop. They didn't apologize. They didn't say, how can we make this right? Instead, they acted like the only issue was that I had noticed. The hearing officer listened to everything, reviewed the documents, and then delivered the decision. The Holloways were ordered to remove the irrigation line, repair the damaged septic system through a licensed contractor, and obtain proper approval for any future work involving that area. They were given 30 days to comply. I remember walking out of that building feeling something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not excitement, not satisfaction, just relief. Because for weeks, I had felt like I was trying to convince people that something obvious had happened. Now the facts were finally where they belonged. But the story didn't end there. Because when people are forced to admit they were wrong, they don't always become humble. Sometimes they become bitter. And the Holloways were about to learn that fixing a mistake is easy compared to accepting responsibility for making one. The deadline came closer, and every morning when I looked out my kitchen window, I could see them on their property. Mark would occasionally look toward my house, and there was no friendliness anymore. No neighborly wave. Just a stare that lasted a little longer than necessary. One afternoon, I was checking the fence line when he walked down toward the property boundary. He stopped several feet away and said, "You really took this that far?" I looked at him and said, "I didn't take it anywhere. You dug the trench." He shook his head. "You could have just let us fix it." I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mark, I tried to talk to you the day I found it. You told me it wasn't a big deal." He looked away for a moment. "We were improving the area." That phrase stuck with me. Improving. Because that's how some people justify crossing boundaries. They convince themselves that because their intention is good, their actions don't matter. But good intentions don't erase consequences. I told him, "Your improvement ended where my property line began." He didn't respond. He just walked back toward his house. A week later, the county arrived with a crew, equipment, and paperwork. This time, there was no arguing, no assumptions, no satellite images. Everything was official. I stood on my porch watching the same kind of machinery that had created the problem now being used to undo it, and there was something almost poetic about that. The same ground they disturbed without permission was being restored under the authority they ignored. The crew carefully removed the irrigation pipe, exposed the damaged sections, and began the repair process. Harold, the county inspector, stood nearby making sure everything was done correctly. Mark watched from his porch with his arms crossed. He looked frustrated, but at that point, frustration wasn't my problem anymore. The rules weren't changing because he didn't like them. The facts weren't disappearing because they were inconvenient. The land was simply being put back the way it should have been from the beginning. When the work was finally finished, the crew reseeded the area and cleaned everything up. The trench disappeared. The pipe disappeared. The evidence of the whole situation slowly faded back into the earth. But the lesson stayed. And honestly, I think that's the part that mattered most. Because this whole thing was never really about a septic field. It was about respect. Respect for property, respect for boundaries, and respect for the idea that being confident doesn't mean being right. The Holloways moved forward with their projects after that, but something between us had changed forever. We weren't enemies. We weren't fighting. We were just neighbors who learned exactly where the line was, and who learned the hard way that some lines are there for a reason. A few months later, if someone drove past my property, they would never know what happened. The grass had grown back, the septic system was working perfectly, and the trench that caused so much trouble had completely disappeared. But I still remembered that day every time I looked across my backyard. Because the biggest damage wasn't the dirt they moved, it was the idea that someone could look at another person's property and decide it was available just because it was convenient. Looking back, I don't believe the Holloways woke up planning to become my enemies. I think they made a mistake. But the real problem was what happened after they discovered it. A mistake can be fixed. A mistake can be forgiven. But a mistake followed by excuses is what turns a simple problem into a battle. If Mark had knocked on my door and said, "Daniel, we messed up. Let's fix this," I probably would have helped him. I wasn't looking for a fight. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I just wanted the same thing every homeowner wants: respect for the place they worked hard to protect. That experience taught me something important. Property isn't just about lines on a survey map or paperwork in a filing cabinet. It's about trust. It's about understanding that what belongs to someone else still matters, even when you can't see it. The pipes underground, the records in a drawer, the boundaries hidden beneath the grass. Those things may seem invisible until the moment someone decides they don't matter, and that's when you realize why they were important all along. I still see the Holloways occasionally. We aren't friends, and honestly, I don't think we ever will be, but there is a quiet understanding now. They know where the line is, and I know I did the right thing by protecting mine, because sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't mean creating a war. Sometimes it simply means refusing to let someone else decide what you should accept. So I want to hear from you. If you were in my position, would you have called the county, or would you have tried to handle it privately with your neighbor? Do you think the Holloways made an honest mistake, or did they cross the line when they decided permission wasn't necessary? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories about unexpected conflicts, justice, and the moments when ordinary people have to stand up for what is right, because sometimes the biggest battles don't happen in a courtroom. Sometimes they start right in your own backyard.